This is the riv nut installer. They call it a threaded insert installer. It's a combination rivet and nut, and it's the one that screws onto the end of the puller, which is sitting next to it, the red handled device here. Sort of like a pop rivet tool, except that the front of the let me start that over. The front of the tool here is threaded, and the riv nut or the threaded insert screws onto that, and then you poke the whole insert into the sheet metal that's already been drilled, and then pull or squeeze the handles, and that will pull the threaded insert or pull the threaded portion of this jaw out. And as it does so, it brings the threaded portion of the insert along with it and crushes the insert so that it squeezes the sheet. It's a pretty nifty device that allows you to shoot or to screw sheets, two sheets, into these easily installed nuts that are permanently installed. Some of these nuts are notched so that they don't spin if you don't squeeze them enough or if you don't pull them enough. But if you do pull them enough, they do grab the sheet pretty securely and won't spin when you put the screw in it or try to take the screw out of it to remove that sheet. These devices here are used as heads or anvils in the rivet squeeze. This is a rivet squeeze here, rivet squeezer, and it's called that because that's exactly what it does. In the head here, the jaws, the sets or these squeeze sets fit into the jaws, and depending on the type of rivet that you have or what you want to do to the sheet actually before the rivet is installed, you can change the heads here or the anvils there so that the sheet is squeezed or the rivet is squeezed, and sometimes the sheet is to be dimpled prior to putting a flush head rivet into the sheet. And the reason that sheets are dimpled after drilled, if you drill two sheets so that the two holes in both sheets are lining up with each other and the rivet goes through both sheets, if you want to install a flush head rivet, sometimes the sheets can be too thin to countersink them. Countersinking is a method that allows a rivet or screw head to sit flush with the sheet if that screw or rivet is designed to be a flush headed screw or rivet. Sometimes the sheet is too thin to allow any kind of removal of material by these devices called countersinks of different sizes, and they scrape away or cut away the flush recess that the screw or rivet head sits into to make it flush with the sheet. And then if the sheet is too thin to remove material with a countersink, which makes the rivet joint weaker, if the sheet is too thin, then the sheet is to be dimpled with a dimple die, which is a device which pushes one side, actually the sheet, into itself, into the other sheet. So it's like placing a screw head into a sheet before it's countersunk or dimpled, and if that screw or rivet is to sit flush, then you would push the rivet deep into the sheet so that it deforms the sheet and makes a concave recess in the sheet by bending it, squeezing it so that it becomes dimpled, and therefore the rivet head can sit flush with the sheet. These are the female portions of the dimple die, and this is the male portion of the dimple die. And what happens is the sheet is drilled, or the sheets are drilled, and the two heads fit together, and they're squeezed together by this rivet squeezer, so that the sheet is deformed and doesn't lose any material from the sheet, so that the joint is still strong, even though the rivet had to be pushed into the sheet to be made flush, to sit flush with the sheet. And the flush design is for streamlining and to make the airplane fly with less drag, parasite drag from rivets that are bulging and sticking out in the airstream. The next device here is a rivet cutter. We talked about it, or we probably will talk about it later. And that's just a device that allows you to have a selection of rivets that are not always perfectly suited for the sheet thicknesses that you want to join. It will cut any size rivet, and including flush head rivets, which you can see on the other side. There are recesses for the flush head. Well, let me see. There it is. It was on the correct side at first. There is a concave here for a flush head rivet to sit in. And then you would just cut the rivet, squeeze it, and it'll cut right in those holes there, and will allow you to cut the rivet to the right length that you need, so that 1.5 times the diameter of the rivet is sticking out of the sheet on the other side before it's been bucked. We talked a little bit about a file, or we will talk about files later. You'll use files quite often, but you always want to use a fine tooth file, preferably a cross-cut file. And the file is to be pushed in one direction only, and that's being pushed away from you. It only cuts in one direction. Don't drag the file both ways. A cross-cut file is designed so that it will not snag and will remove material faster. But the finer the teeth, the finer and smoother the final job. This is a wire brush, a wire bristle brush, and it is a steel bristles brush. Do not scrape aluminum with one of those. Don't use steel with aluminum. This assortment of rivets here in the box, these are called blind rivets, and they're not called blind because a person is blind that uses them, but they're blind because, or they're, I'm going to pause here a second. They're called blind because one side of the material that is being joined is not available or not seen by the person doing the riveting. One side is blind to the riveter. And this rivet is like a pop rivet. It is a pop rivet in a way, except that the shank of it is a steel shank rather than an aluminum shank. And it goes in a device similar to the riv nut puller, but it goes into a pop rivet puller. And sometimes they'll call it a cherry rivet puller. And this is the puller here. And it's similar, very similar to the riv nut tool. The rivet is placed in the receiver, I'd call it, in the head of the puller, and the handles are squeezed after the rivet is pushed through the hole of the sheet that has been drilled, and gives it a quick installation, so that the joint is a strong joint if the hole and rivet size or diameters match each other correctly, and if the sheets are held closely together before the pulling is done. And it's a strong joint if the shank of the pop rivet or steel pull rivet is steel and not aluminum. These devices here are called cleco pliers. They're used to install and remove clecos, which are the spring-loaded clamps. And I'll get one or two of those for you so that you can see how they operate. the pliers and the cleco as a unit are squeezed and then poked into a drilled hole, and when they are all the way through, the right size drilled hole, and the clamp is released, then the sheets are pulled and held tightly together temporarily with a cleco and cleco pliers.